Hello and welcome to our first lecture on how web pages work. And the reason why we're doing this is because it is the last project that you have to do, which has to do with modifying a web page or understanding a little bit about the code. And we will go into how you're going to do that later on. It is not necessarily difficult, but right now we're just going to try to understand the basics of how web pages work. Okay, so how web pages work. First of all, why are we doing this in the first place? What is the important aspect of the internet in relation to this class? And simply put, it is interactive multimedia. It is one of the greatest tools for corporate communication that have ever existed, or communication in general. I would say that it is more significant than the development of the printing press in many ways. This was a game changer. And so like PowerPoint, the web page can deliver customized content that can include text, images, audio, and motion pictures. You can basically put anything into these things, and it's universally available. You can also change it very easily. Online experiences are more interactive, meaning that your users can explore your web page. You can create content for them to explore, kind of like writing a newsletter where they don't have to see all of it necessarily, but they can read whatever part they want. And each audience member can experience a different path, meaning that you don't have to do it in the same order. And another thing that's interesting about this is that the content can be updated instantly. Instead of sending out, thousands of copies of a newsletter and then finding out that the information is no longer current, you can just update the information on a website and it's automatically current. Every user decides what they want to see and ignore. And basically what I've just said, instead of bringing thousands of people to a presentation, all of those people can see the presentation where they are. And instead of printing thousands of copies of a newsletter, only one is necessary for a web page. And so essentially this is why corporate communication needs the internet and why it is an automatic relationship here. It's a very important bond. Now the internet model, one of the reasons why we want to talk about this, we want to talk about how the internet works so we can understand how to work it. A lot of people drive cars, they have no idea how an engine works. Oftentimes that's okay, but if you're going to design cars, you should know something about how they work. And so the same thing with the internet. If we're going to surf the internet, then that's fun. We can pretend it's magic. But if we're going to actually design pages or modify pages, it's nice to understand what, in fact, we're doing. Now, the first thing we want to understand is that the World Wide Web is different than the internet in air quotes. The internet existed since the 1960s. Basically, this was a collection of supercomputers that shared information across the country, and they were connected together, and the internet structure was designed to protect this information and to basically protect it from espionage and the threat of nuclear war. And originally there were very few servers compared to today, but the World Wide Web dispensed information back and forth. And then gradually it moved on to education centers besides just government, and eventually commerce as well. Now the World Wide Web was developed in the 90s. And the reason why that's important is because that's really what you think of when you think of the internet, when you go to a web page. Before the World Wide Web happened, there really weren't any web pages. And so what you would have would be a very different internet experience. So since the development of the World Wide Web, everything has begun a lot faster, more consistent, and cheaper. I'll explain why that was in a minute. Prior to the World Wide Web, all computers needed to be contacted directly. You could have thousands of servers out there, and maybe not more than thousands. You could have big computers, and if you wanted to get access, for example, to your local library, they might have a modem line that you could tie into, and then suddenly your computer screen becomes the card catalog, and then you can operate it like you would if you were at some sort of a terminal in the library. And so that was a kind of experience that you might have. But the problem is, let's say that you wanted to do this, but you were in Japan and your library was in Wisconsin. Then you can do that. You can dial into it, assuming they'll let you in. But then you might have an incredibly high long distance bill. And so that was a very common problem to have. Also, access to information would depend on permissions. If you didn't have permission to be on the server, you basically had to beg, and they didn't have to let you in. So if you were doing research, you might find it very tedious and very confusing. Now, the World Wide Web established the idea of networks of a network of interconnected servers, all with their own unique address. And all of these systems could contact each other and request information. So essentially, the World Wide Web could have started with a few computers, and then basically more were added. And so those big computers that you might not have had access before, eventually they would at least have some presence there where you could get information. And this created what we now call the client-server relationship, which is what we're going to talk about now. Now, the client-server relationship is how your computer communicates with your website, and how your website communicates with your computer. So first of all, this is the first thing to establish is who is the client. The client is not the computer nor the user. So if you're surfing the web, you are not the client. And neither is the computer itself. The computer itself doesn't really know how to do anything. It's just hardware. The browser program, on the other hand, is the client. The browser program is designed to navigate the World Wide Web. And that was part of the World Wide Web, the establishment of the concept of the browser. And so the browser program basically goes out there and gets it for you. And so it interprets the internet and basically brings it home to you. So who is the server? So if you've got a client, which is the browser, the server is the website, but it's important to understand that a server is a computer like any other computer. And so you could have a server for example, Methodist University, and that's just going to be a computer. If you saw it, you'd think it was a regular workstation or something like that. It might be designed slightly differently. It might be shaped slightly differently. It might be rack mounted somewhere, but it's still basically going to be a computer. And every website has a server which can be located anywhere physically. Sometimes they're on big server farms where they're kept in air-conditioned buildings, or you could have it in your own home. You could have a server that's set up to be on the internet. And the server's job is to do nothing but give out information. So we're going to talk about how that works. And so we're going to describe a typical transaction. So the first thing to understand is what the internet service provider is, because this is important to the idea of the client-server relationship. Now, the ISP is usually identified by a server one uses for email. And that's important to understand. For example, if your email address ends with methodist.edu, that means that when you surf the internet, you're going as methodist.edu. That's where all of your requests are coming from. And that's where they're all going back to. And so if, on the other hand, you have a Gmail email address, it's not really the same as your ISP, most likely, but you could have an email address charter, for example, if you're using that service. And so then that is a hosting system where you have that as your internet service provider. And when you're logged into an internet service provider, the internet sees you as that and vice versa, as we've said. Now, the computer itself may be one of many official connections, each requiring permission, name, and password. So you are not the only user of the methodist.edu. If that's where you happen to be, there are loads of people, but there has to be a finite number. There's only so many people that can be logged into any server at the same time. But on the internet itself, on the World Wide Web, you could have many times as many requests going on. We'll talk about why that's possible. And you don't need permission to access most websites, meaning that once you get permission to log on to your ISP, that is your permission for everything else. Okay, so after this point, we talk about the browser. What does the browser do during this transaction? When the user types in a web address into the browser, it tries to interpret it as an IP address. The browser will literally reach out and see if the IP address is genuine and find out what it is. Now, once it finds that number, which you don't have to know, It's like 10.4.6.2700, or no, not that much. But you get the idea. It's a series of 4 numbers, and whatever those are, that's the IP address. And so when it finds that series of 4 numbers, it will reach out to that computer and request its index file. So it doesn't log in to the server. It simply sends the server a message, and the server responds. So when the server responds to the request, it's also sending out requests to many other clients. And when the file arrives, when the file arrives from the server to the internet service provider, the browser will receive it and the browser will interpret it. And so the browser interprets it as HTML code. And that's important to understand. The entire internet is based on HTML code. Even today it is. There's a lot of other code out there, but the backbone has to be HTML. And so HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And it is simple text, which is why it is so powerful. It can be read on any word processor. In fact, it can be read on Notepad, which is the most simple program your computer comes with. It doesn't cost anything. In fact, absolutely nothing about the web page design concept has to cost anything at all. Basically, we're talking text, and you can just type it. And if you know exactly what to type, you can make anything. And so the code is based on tags, which are words surrounded by angle brackets. And so when you're typing something onto a web page, angle brackets are not generally good to have in a web page if they're not intended to be codes. And we'll get into that when we talk about coding. The browser interprets the code and displays the web page. And so most of it is going to be the text. If you've got, let's say a document online that has a lot of words in it, all of those words are text, they're going to be in the code. And so the part of the words that aren't the part of the code that isn't the words would include formatting information. And so color information, font choices, bold, italicized, underline, all of those things are coded as tags, as those words that are inside of angle bracket. And so that would also include pictures. Now pictures, if you're going to include pictures or other non-text information into a web page, that's part of the code too. That requires a tag to reference the picture. And so any non-text information is referenced in the code, and all of these require a different connection, meaning once the browser downloads the code, starts putting together the page, if it sees a spot where a picture is needed, it will have to go back to the server and say, give me that picture. Then when the picture comes in, it will display it on the page, which is why your page doesn't always load all at the same time. And a web page displayed may not be identical to the one originally intended, meaning that every computer may be interpreting this slightly differently, depending on what fonts the computer has, what the computer's characteristics are, how old the computer is, and things like that. Okay, so that was a very basic introduction to what the internet is and why we're doing this. Now, the good news is most of this stuff is outside the realm of what we're doing. To design a web page, you don't have to build a server. You don't really have to understand everything about the intricacies of networks. Basically, all you have to do is understand how code works, how text works. So if all you want to do is modify a web page, chances are you can by opening up the code, looking at where the actual words are, and updating that. And we'll show you how to do that this week.